Muy buenas, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estáis? Bienvenidos a otro Memory Card. Estamos en un espacio muy interesante, muy distinto al habitual. Y lo hacemos para volver con un profiles que nos ha hecho mucha ilusión no solo realizar esa entrevista maravillosa a dos protagonistas de la industria como son John y Brenda Romero, pero sobre todo en la composición que nos ha quedado final con ese trabajazo de Rubén, al que doy un saludo enorme porque se lo ha currado al tío, y que creo que con todo lo que ellos nos han contado y lo que él ha hecho vais a disfrutar de un programa tremendo. En fin, un profiles, como digo, que tiene a dos protagonistas que son leyendas dentro del sector y que tienen mucho que decir no solo del pasado, de lo que les hizo en su día famosos, sino del presente, porque tienen pues una actividad todavía muy del día a día. Chicos, os dejamos con este profiles, como digo, bienvenidos una vez más a Memory Card.
No son muchos los nombres que se asocian a un cambio de paradigma en la industria. Innovar al punto de reinventar o crear directamente un género no es algo de lo que puedan presumir demasiados en el mundillo. Y por eso este Memory Card Profiles resulta tan especial. Y lo es también porque, no contentos con tener hoy con nosotros a uno de esos nombres, a una leyenda del sector que vivió y promovió uno de esos puntos de inflexión con su trabajo, en este programa único contamos además con la presencia de una mujer cuya historia en el medio se remonta a los cada vez más lejanos, pero cruciales, años 80, y que nos ha regalado en este programa algunas de las reflexiones más interesantes que hemos oído en mucho tiempo. John y Brenda Romero. Dos figuras de incuestionable relevancia por sus trayectorias que unieron sus caminos también en lo profesional hace años para sumar conocimiento a su aventura empresarial y que con sus opiniones, recuerdos y reflexiones han hecho de este Memory Card Profiles un programa a dos voces irrepetible. Él, figura central de aquella ID software que revolucionara la industria con el primer gran FPS, Doom. Ella, íntimamente ligada al rol a través de la saga Wizardry. Y ambos diseñadores reconocidos con perfiles diferentes, pero que juntos tienen mucho que decir.
First question is for both of you, because I would like to know, I know a little bit of the story, but I'd like you to tell me how you both got started in video games, programming and the like. Since I think that you had different like starters and you have like different roots in the industry, I would like you to tell me a little bit of that, how you got started in it.
Getting started early in the industry means you did not take a standard path into it. And yeah, definitely. And even when I got into programming, most people didn't even have computers at home. I mean, we didn't have one. I didn't know anyone that had one. And I just kind of lucked into, my friend telling me about, a place where we could play video games without money. And it was like, wow. So I followed him up to the local college and we went to the computer science building. And it was summertime, so there really wasn't that many people there. And we started playing text games on mainframe computer through terminals. And through that, I started asking the students what they were doing. They were programming, and I asked them what the words meant. And I just started experimenting it on my own and just started learning how to code. And it was another 3 years of doing that and going to stores and, every store that had a computer, just getting on them and programming and not really being able to save anything. But when I finally got a computer in 1982 at the house, that's when it really took off, and I knew that I was going to be programming and making games for a career.
Los primeros pasos de John responden al esquema de muchos de los genios y figuras del sector, algunos ya parte de la familia de Memory Card Profiles, por cierto, para los que los secretos de la programación y el desarrollo empiezan en los 80 de forma casi autodidacta. Y como él muy bien dice, los que los dieron entonces no acabaron siguiendo un camino tradicional o habitual porque sencillamente tal camino no existía. Puede que ese crecer desde la curiosidad que a muchos les llevó a labrarse una carrera en el sector sea clave en cómo sumaron al mismo años después con sus revolucionarios aportes a este, pero también lo es sin duda la sincronicidad que supuso ese querer saber más sobre lo que a priori no era más que un hobby en un tiempo aquel en que todo estaba aún por descubrir.
I really was right place, right time. So I've been playing games like D&D from the time I was 11. I loved making games, and I don't mean video games, I mean board games. So one thing that John and I do share is we both come from low-income backgrounds. And so if we wanted to have fun, we had to make it in most cases. It wasn't like there were toys provided or games. And so for me, we spent a lot of time going to yard sales, like a dime that I could use to buy a game, but you could never buy an actual functional board game. It was always missing some pieces. But I ended up collecting those pieces and I started making my own games. So that's the necessary ingredients for the right place, right time portion of the story, which is that when I was 15, this young woman, her name then was Linda Saratek, and her family owned a game company, which was unbelievably in Ogdensburg, New York. And Ogdensburg is it's a very rural area in northern New York, top of the state on the Canadian border. And they were looking for somebody who could answer the phones when people called in with questions about wizardry, which was the first-person perspective RPG. It's the one, for people who haven't heard of it, it's, Final Fantasy. It was the inspiration for Final Fantasy and largely the inspiration, in fact, for most JRPGs. The job I had was to play the game, memorize it, and when people called to ask questions, because there was no internet that the average person could access, that I knew the answers to those questions.
Nintendo Gameplay, this is Jenny. How may I help you?
Esos servicios telefónicos eran comunes en los 80, con jugones como los que llamaban desde sus casas al otro lado, dispuestos a ayudarles con lo que fuera que les tenía atascados en el juego de turno. Y como vemos, no solo Nintendo supo sacarle partido por mucho que el suyo fuera el más famoso de esos servicios, operativo hasta bien entrado los 90 con el Club Nintendo a la cabeza por estos lares. Para Brenda aquello fue un flechazo, un romance con la industria que la llevó a querer ahondar más en ella, pese a que su residencia entonces, al norte de Nueva York, como ella nos contaba, no le facilitaba las cosas en contraste con John, que estaba en California y que tenía por eso una visión más cercana de lo enorme que era el sector ya en esos años. Y aún así, la llegada también en su caso de un ordenador a casa supuso un punto de inflexión en su carrera.
So my mother also picked up a used computer somewhere. It was a VIC-20, which you couldn't do much with. I mean, a single app on an iPhone is far more powerful than any VIC-20 was. But I for the same stuff with John, just experimenting, I fell in love with it. It was more fun to me than Legos, more fun than any toy that I may have gotten my hands on.
Aquellos ordenadores fueron, como hemos visto ya en varias ocasiones en Profiles, una puerta al mundo de la programación para muchos de nuestros protagonistas. Y no deja de sorprender que también lo fueran en los Estados Unidos, donde las consolas pronto despuntaron en el mercado del ocio digital con marcas patrias como Atari y foráneas como Nintendo, que hizo de Norteamérica su fortín en Occidente durante los 80. En Europa, la popularidad de los microordenadores sí alcanzó la década siguiente, tras unos años de éxito rotundo gracias a los micros británicos, Spectrum y Amstrad sobre todo, pero que los grandes nombres del sector dieran sus primeros pasos con ordenadores domésticos habla de la importancia del mismo independientemente de dónde miremos y de las máquinas que pongamos en el foco.
In terms of development, our early careers are dominated by development for the personal computer, whether it's the Apple and then moving into PC. I mean, John and I have worked on literally every platform, including tabletop. So it's hard to say, but I feel that, John has, I could let him say that. For me, my gaming experience, there was not a chance that I was even able to afford a console. That would never have happened. My experience, for me, wasn't so much consoles, but arcades. So the games that I could create at home, because especially if we're talking the 80s, the games that I could create at home, I would go to the arcade. They were so night and day what I could do on the VIC-20 versus what I would see with, like Ms. Pac-Man or Tron or any of the games in the arcades. I didn't even make a connection that these two things were related. I mean, that's how far apart they seemed. So for me, the correlation isn't so much PC and console, it's more PC and arcades.
Well, the 80s had so many different computers, it was crazy. There was a magazine called Byte Magazine that covered at least 10 computers that were the most popular ones. And, this was still, the early 80s was the era of people still making computers out of kits. So, there were computers that had the fourth language in ROM, and they had joysticks on next to the keyboard. I mean, there were so many crazy computers back there trying to set standards, but the standards ended up being the Radio Shack computers, the Commodore computers, and Apple computers. And then the Mac came out in '84, but it was not as strong as the other ones at that time, but it got stronger over time. The Amiga and the ST came in later in the '80s to try and define some new standard, but everything died at the end of the '80s with just the growth of the PC and the PC hardware switching to the 386, which really dominated all other platforms that were out there. And it was 16-bit, actually 32-bit with 386. So like even 16-bit era computers, which were like the Atari ST and the Amiga, those things were dying. 8-bit absolutely was dead, and 16-bit was a really fast move. 16-bit lived, mostly in console with the Genesis and the SNES, but computers were already 32-bit, and computers were the ones that were driving change in gaming outside of arcades.
Fue en el PC donde John viviría sus primeros grandes éxitos, precisamente. La tecnología que, como él mismo describe, permitió revolucionar en muchos sentidos la industria, no solo a nivel técnico, sino a nivel jugable y de diseño, vivía paralela al mundo de las consolas, que aún tardaría en subirse al carro, por ejemplo, de las 3D. Y en ese querer ir más allá de John y sus compañeros en ID Software, los compatibles resultaron ser el mejor entorno para tratar de llevar al mercado doméstico lo que de otro modo solo podía disfrutarse en los salones.
In the 90s, when id Software proved that you could play arcade quality games on a PC, starting with the Commander Keen hardware scrolling, that was huge for the PC. And then when we started doing 3D with Wolfenstein, that really absolutely killed any other computer that was that like say the Amiga as an example, because you just couldn't do that. And console hardware was not built to do 3D at the time, so all the new consoles like the N64, the PlayStation, etc., those had to switch to 3D chips as fast as possible, but we'd already started leading that on PC.
Wolfenstein fue sin duda una revolución y un puñetazo sobre la mesa con el que ID Software puso a las claras lo que era capaz de hacer. Tan es así que mucha gente marca ahí el comienzo de la carrera profesional de Romero, justo antes de Doom, su gran éxito. Pero nada más lejos. Como él mismo cuenta, antes de ese hito con el que exprimieron al PC y dieron el salto hacia el eje Z, que revolucionaría para siempre el videojuego, John ya tenía una dilatada carrera plagada de experiencia y títulos.
Career-wise, I started my career really in the 80s, and if you talk about, say, Wolfenstein, as a lot of people think, oh, Wolfenstein, this is John's first game. It was actually my 87th game. 87. I'd already made 86 games before Wolfenstein. Yeah. So I had a really big, I had a really good career in the 80s on an Apple II. But then in 89 I shifted to the PC.
Puede que por eso, con la llegada de la nueva década y de esa máquina en la que desde entonces se centraría, lograra revolucionar el sector como lo hizo. Wolfenstein fue la piedra de toque, pero el gran hito vino en 1993 con Doom, sin lugar a dudas. El shooter demoníaco marciano de Romero, Carmack y CIA marcó un antes y un después en muchos sentidos, desde lo artístico y lo técnico a lo jugable, y los disparos digitales tras él ya nunca serían lo mismo. Pero, ¿por qué fue así? ¿Qué hizo que Doom resultara tan arrollador entonces y qué hace que siga resultando tan fresco y jugable a día de hoy? ¿Dónde reside la clave de semejante acierto en todos los niveles?
That's 3D.
Well, obviously the design and the technology worked really well together at the time, and that game emerged with so much new stuff in it at once, like multiplayer over modems, multiplayer over local network, deathmatch, which people had never done before, co-op, single-player campaign. A game set in the future, fighting demons from hell was not a subject that was in any game created. But yeah, I mean, it had so much stuff. Modding, the birth of the modding community, because we supported that with Doom, making it an open game. The engine technology itself was just so good because we were like very hardcore programmers, and it was really important that our games would always run at the correct speed no matter what year it was. We even did this adaptive programming. So if you were running the game on a slower machine, it would still skip frames, but still move at the correct speed. So you would, no matter how slow your machine was, you would always end up at the same place as like the fastest computer. But we made Doom on a 33 megahertz computers, but it will run on crazy gigahertz because of the way that we tied it to the hardware timing chip in the computer. So it would never run too fast. It would always have the same experience going on forever.
Es fácil entender a la vista de todo ello el porqué de la frescura que Doom sigue destilando a día de hoy, pero es que además de todo eso, de sus innovaciones técnicas y argumentales, el papel de John como diseñador fue si cabe aún más importante. Cada aspecto del juego estaba pensado con mimo y detalle, de forma que todo funcionase armónicamente y que en su conjunto el jugador fuera consciente de que tenía entre manos algo nunca antes visto.
But the design of it was simple. It was the design of the weapons to never invalidate a prior weapon like Wolfenstein did. If you had a pistol and you go to the machine gun, who cares about the pistol? If you go to the Gatling gun, who cares about the machine gun? But in Doom, every weapon had a purpose, and even the weapons that use the same kind of ammo had a different purpose than another weapon with the same type of ammo. So the weapon design was incredibly important, and the balance of those weapons, the time to kill on every enemy was important for the feel of the game. The AI was really, really well done. Very simple, but did not require anything that level designers would need to put in a map. There were no hint nodes. There were no paths. None of that. The AI is so good that it can find you no matter where you're at. Birth of the BSP for speed, rendering speed, which every game used for decades after that. Shareware distribution, giving that game away for free. Yeah. The thing that we did differently with Doom than any other game that we had done was that we proactively contacted companies that had a retail presence and told them that they could take Doom, put it on a disc or CD, and put it in a box in the store, and we don't want any money. They can just make $9 off of it and go crazy. So that was the time where you could go into a store and see 10 different Doom boxes, and they all have the same thing in them because it was just a free shareware copy.
Algo que nunca se había hecho antes, o al menos no de ese modo, y que ellos ya nunca más hicieron, pero con lo que lograron demostrar la importancia de tener claro qué y cómo, o lo que es lo mismo, lo grande del producto con que trabajas y el proceso ideado para llevarlo a las máquinas de los usuarios, revolucionando una industria en el camino. Tal fue su trascendencia que Doom ha recorrido las entrañas de casi toda máquina pensada para jugar que haya existido, ya sea a través de ports oficiales o de homebrews para sistemas que jamás soñaron con ejecutar el mito de Romero y Cía. Y ya no solo consolas y ordenadores, sino casi todo chisme con pantalla en una suerte de reto viral que maravilla por lo loco del resultado y que según John se debe, de nuevo, a lo acertado de su diseño.
Doom is just a very clean, tight core that basically has one line in the renderer that is in C, and if you change that to the hardware that you're putting it on, it'll go at a very fast speed. And if not, it'll run at whatever speed the compiler can turn that line of C in, but it will run. But so the code is very portable, which is why you see it running on pregnancy tests and in Teslas and pianos and toasters.
Yeah, well, I find it crazy.
Everything it was not meant to be run on.
Yeah, there's always like, what will be next? No, what will be the next device? Yep. It will run, and that's crazy.
Contact lenses.
Un código depurado al máximo, bien pensado y ejecutado, y un diseño brillante. Con esos ingredientes, Doom logró lo que ningún otro juego había logrado, pero lo cierto es que muchos son los juegos que han triunfado sin necesidad de revoluciones técnicas gracias a un diseño acertado y creativo. Brenda, que lleva décadas trabajando de lleno en ese aspecto crucial del desarrollo, utiliza una metáfora que ilustra de maravilla la importancia del mismo y quiso compartirla con nosotros.
Let's just say that you go into a house and it's been built. It looks decently attractive. The walls are painted, but that itself that's what happens when there's no design or limited design. Now we could say that the architect showed up, right? But we've got a space. So let's just put aside the design that went into constructing that space. Once we let players into the space, the question comes, what are they going to do? How do we want them to feel when they leave, right? So we can take something like, Five Nights at Freddy's. What are they going to do? Well, if you played the game, you know what you're going to do. How do we want them to feel? On edge and terrified. But that experience that we want to create, that's a designed experience. And that's the role of the designer. What happens to the player from the moment of beginning game to end game? What is the overall flow of that? And then there are questions that designers, like that's in the most general sense, but there are questions that designers consider. Why would the player want to do this one thing? Why would they, how is what they're doing making the core of the game stronger? Do we really need to have this thing in a game? I mean, it would be great. There are some worlds, I'm sure, in which games are not constrained by time or budgets, but that's not every world. That's in fact rarely the case. So then you really have to figure out what the scope is going to be. What can you do, right? Like if I go back to my house metaphor, you can't have a party for 500 people in a 3-bedroom house. Well, not well anyway. So it's looking at what you have, the people you have, and what kind of experience you can create in that time. And ultimately, it's a very collaborative experience.
Recuerde, nada de ruso.
Hoy hemos superado muchos tabúes en la industria y el videojuego abraza con moderada normalidad cuestiones temáticas que en otros medios audiovisuales siempre han sido habituales. Pero en los primeros 90, el debate sobre la violencia en los videojuegos estaba al rojo vivo, y los títulos que salieron de la factoría de ID Software, con Doom por supuesto a la cabeza, tuvieron que lidiar con la crítica también por su visceralidad y brutalidad. Fue un obstáculo con el que lidiar en aquellos años de cambio de perspectiva en la industria, también en ese sentido, con un nuevo tipo de jugador más maduro como destinatario de sus juegos. ¿Eran conscientes del revuelo que en aquellos años se dio, como nos recordaba Kalinski en su Profiles, en torno a la cada vez más presente violencia explícita en los videojuegos?
Yeah, so we were in our mid-20s and we didn't really pay attention to the news. You know, I mean, we made games that we wanted to play, and the games got violent, you know, like right after, even while making Commander Keen, which was kind of a cute kind of game. You know, me and Adrian were definitely about metal and violence, and you know, Carmack also had, you know, he was no stranger to that, and so making like Catacomb 3D, where you got demons and orcs coming at you, and you're burning them down with fireballs, that just wasn't enough. And then really it was Wolfenstein. You know, Wolfenstein was where guns came in, and the violence and the audio, and putting those together, it sounded and played amazing. Like for us, it was just like, oh my God, I've never played a game like this. This is so cool.
There you go.
You know, and it's like, okay, that worked. Why don't we go further?
Yeah.
You know, and so we did that with Doom. Even though I think Doom was kind of less violent, you know, like the reaction of like the Nazis with blood spraying out of their mouth and stuff, and you're killing humans.
Yeah.
It's so different with Doom. And there's all kinds of different, you know, demons there.
The dogs as well in Wolfenstein. The dogs are.
Yeah, and they talk in Wolfenstein. And so in Doom, they don't talk. They're not human. They're harder to kill, but you have cooler weapons. And so, you know, I think that's probably one of the magic ingredients we had as well with that game. Is just like you weren't killing people or dogs like Wolfenstein. And, you know, we're not doing it in an over-the-top way. We're doing it in a way that, like, makes sense for what you're doing. Without being too graphic, because that wasn't like the point of it. Wasn't that it was the challenge of getting through those levels and defeating the enemy. It wasn't about how much blood can you put on the screen. To us, that was just like a side effect of you shooting something.
It's important that we look at video games culturally, and you know, if we look at Doom, let's compare Doom, which really not how we remember Doom in our head is this incredibly visceral, violent experience. But go look at it now. Go watch a video of it now, and it's like comic violence, right? It's not, you know, it's actually, it's at the time, sure, it seemed wild, but let's think about, you know, Doom is 1993. Let's think back to the 70s, right? I'll compare Doom versus A Clockwork Orange, right? Which Clockwork Orange is 1971, or like, Taxi Driver, which is 1976, and then, or The Godfather, also in the 70s. That's a time of the Vietnam War. So violence in movies, in books, and on the news, right, is I would say just a shocking amount more present than Doom ever could possibly make it. But video games, because video games are presumed to be just a media that is played by children, somehow this is a problem. And of course, that's not the case. It wasn't the case then, it wasn't the case now. But any new media has gone through this, literally any new media, even books went through this.
Comic books.
Comic books went through it. So any new media went through it. And really what Doom did was gave Black Sabbath and Judas Priest a rest. And Black Sabbath and Judas Priest shared the spotlight with Dungeons and Dragons. I guess the late 80s, mid 80s, early 90s was sort of the height of the satanic panic. So John's games were playing right into that, not intentionally, right? But the reality is I don't think, especially when we consider Doom on the landscape of the media that was available. I think that games, now hopefully we're outgrowing this because it doesn't come up. It doesn't come up nearly as much as it used to. I think games are being accepted among the acceptable pantheon of media that adults consume.
Y todo eso, claro, los avances en cuanto a aceptación y perspectiva, con un evidente cambio generacional en cuanto al consumo, en lo tocante a la violencia y a la posibilidad de incluirla de forma orgánica y libre de traumas en el medio. Pero hay otros aspectos que tal vez no han recibido el mismo trato y que siguen arrastrando un cierto halo de tabú en la industria, como por ejemplo el sexo. Brenda, que es autora de un libro que versa precisamente sobre eso, Sex and Video Games, tiene también su opinión al respecto.
Some of it comes down to money. The most popular games are games where you blow shit up. But then I think a lot of it has to do with video game ratings. So if a game was rated AO, adults only, you could not sell that game in big box stores. And it didn't take much to get over that AO threshold because you couldn't afford, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, to rely on digital distribution. Like that was just the kiss of death. So that constrains video games to what they can present. Now, those rating systems, the biggest market for games is in the United States. In the United States, it favors violence. You can shoot just a line of 100 people, and that might get you an M rating. But if you show one bare breast, you are AO. Now, the ratings may have changed to accommodate that, but some of our biggest, like the game Bully, which had, I think Bully had an M rating. There were two boys could kiss in Bully, and that they threatened to re-rate it because of that to AO. There were games, I think it was the Elder Scrolls game, where you could actually remove all of a character's clothing in the inventory screen, and you could see breasts. Oh my God, right? Potential re-rating. So if the U.S. market is going to dictate the development of games because of its size, because the U.S. market considers violence to be more acceptable than a woman's breast, that means that you are much more likely to see violence than to see intimacy. Now, I do feel that this has changed. But anyway, I think it comes down to mostly ratings tolerance and the perception of who plays video games.
La visión de Brenda al respecto resume algo que el videojuego tiene aún en su debe, tantos años después. Y aprovechando su presencia en Profiles, quisimos ahondar también en otro asunto que del mismo modo suele pasarse por alto o que ocupa un lugar en muchas ocasiones secundario cuando se presta atención a la industria desde el punto de vista de sus nombres y personalidades.
Because I go wandering around airports and people come up to me and say, "When's the next plane leave for Houston?"
El papel de la mujer en el sector y la visibilidad que éste tiene y ha tenido. Tanto ella como John tienen muy claro lo relevante, trascendente e imprescindible que ha sido su labor desde los albores del ocio digital, y cómo sin ellas, pese a la injusticia con que muchas veces se ha tratado su legado y se ha gestionado su recuerdo, casi nada de lo que hoy disfrutamos habría sido posible.
Women started programming. They created compilers, assembly language. I mean, women started everything that the industry depends on, and the early game industry had some real standout females like Roberta Williams. But what's not really mentioned is the amount of women that were actually working on those teams. Like Sierra Online had so many women working on the art of the game and marketing and production, but they're not the ones on the box. You know, that was back in the days of putting people's names on boxes. But I know that Brenda can actually answer this better.
Yeah, I think so. An interesting thing, I'm going to give you a take that probably is I've never answered this question this way. And here's what I think. I know there were women there because I was there. I'm not the only woman who was there. But I can't tell you how many times I will get an email, because John and I have an email box that comes to both of us. It's just an information thing on our site. And they will ask John to participate in a game designers of the something, top 10 this, blah, blah, blah. And they're usually looking, or it's a documentary about people in the industry who were there at the time. And so John has recently started asking the question, how many people of color are involved? How many women are you interviewing? Can you tell me the demographics of the people in this? Overwhelmingly, the demographics are all male. And John has actually refused to participate in a few of those until they corrected the diversity. And so really, I was there. Many other women were there. Why aren't those women remembered? Ask the press who don't remember them. Ask the people who write books with all male table of contents. Ask the conference organizers who have a bunch of men listed. I recently talked with a museum that's putting together a project featuring people who were in the game industry early. And when John asked what the breakdown was, there were 2 women to 20 men. The email came to both of us. In some cases, like I less to do is better for me. So I never say like, I want to be part of that, right? Like I never just show up unless I'm invited. But the amount of times I hear, well, I just couldn't find any women, or there weren't any women around. Well, I get my professional advice, and I'll use the professional wording for this. Do your fucking research, right? I'm like, and you can quote me on that. There were a lot of women there. If you say you can't find women, do your fucking research. We were there. I know we were there. There were many of us. In fact, there were multiple Brendas even. There were
you were
many
hired by
women.
a woman.
Yeah. So there were many women in the industry back then. And there are still many women today. And so the view of the industry is predominantly this male-centric space, always has been, always will be, is simply not accurate.
La lista de mujeres cuyo papel fue clave en el desarrollo de la industria es enorme, desde las trabajadoras de las plantas de Dundee en Escocia, donde se ensamblaba el Spectrum y que revolucionaron la economía local y la microinformática europea, al equipo de programadoras que trabajaron en el ENIAC, el mítico megacomputador de 1943, y que en su 50 aniversario no iban a ser invitadas porque de nuevo no recibieron el reconocimiento que merecían. Su papel es crucial en tantos elementos y en tantos juegos que mencionarlas a todas es casi imposible.
The bug was named by Grace Hopper. Wi-Fi was created by Hedy Lamarr. BASIC, which most programmers started on.
I must have used
that. Was actually, Yeah, most people started there. One of the instrumental members of that team was Sister Mary. Oh my goodness, I'm forgetting Sister Mary Kenneth.
Yeah,
I'll have to get her name.
Yeah. All right, don't worry about that. I'll do my research.
Yeah, so
later on.
there's loads of women,
Yeah,
loads and loads of women. So anyway, why aren't women there? I have the same question, because we were there.
El FPS, que con el trabajo de John y el resto de miembros de ID asentó de algún modo las bases y sus fundamentos, siguió durante años el trazado de esos títulos pioneros, añadiendo poco a poco elementos que con el tiempo hicieron del género algo bastante distinto de lo que era en sus orígenes. Esa acción directa, descarnada, casi arcade en su esencia, sin más complicación que avanzar batiendo enemigos y potenciando nuestra fuerza destructiva con ítems y armas nuevos. Algo que funcionó entonces y que sobre todo con el regreso de Doom en 2016 demostró que sigue teniendo su público. ¿Qué opina John de ese revival del shooter clásico?
Well, I think it's great, and there's a lot of retro shooters out there that are amazing as well. Even though the Doom 2016 revived the IP and retained the aggressiveness and speed of the game, the content, you versus hell, it's like future sci-fi, space marine versus hell. People really still, that gameplay was great back then. It didn't get worse, it was great. It was really fun, and a lot of games have added or changed the formula, and a lot of players get used to it. But then when those players experience a game that it has more of the retro feel, they also like that too. It's not like they're rejecting the current stuff. It's just like a lot of times the current stuff is overburdened with over-design, and lots of either ways of trying to get you to pay money that are just like a pyramid, trying to get a bunch of these things and you get this next thing, and then you could buy this and all that, versus the simplicity of a game that was just made to challenge you and to get through it. It's refreshing to play something that feels really good, that is very simple.
Yeah.
And the indie market is full of this stuff. It's full of great games that are very simple, that also have a retro theme or inspirations. And some people do like the experience of a massive multiplayer thing where people just blasting each other and you're like upgrading your weapons and like buying stuff, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. That's a totally different way of playing a game. It's a different mind space, a different balance. And then there's just like the simplicity of just plowing through something and not having any of that upgrade, like no upgrade systems, minimal UI, you name it, those were great. No tutorials,
Una sencillez que se abraza hoy día porque la diversión pura y dura está presente en ese tipo de propuesta, cada vez más abundante. El propio John quiso además sumar a esa oferta hace unos años a través de una campaña de Kickstarter con un nuevo proyecto para el que iba de la mano de Adrian Carmack, llamado Black Room, y con el que pretendía retomar esos valores que ellos mismos asentaron en el 93 con Doom, pero por desgracia aquello no llegó a salir adelante. Y también, por desgracia, pese a nuestra insistencia para que nos contara qué es lo que pasó, su respuesta al respecto deja todos estos años después aún más interrogantes.
I can't talk about Black Room.
You can't.
I can't talk about it. That's my answer.
All right.
My standard answer is I can't talk about Black Room.
I knew that was coming. That's me smiling.
Really? Okay. I didn't know about that. I didn't know that you couldn't talk about it, but anyway.
Yeah.
Ocurriera lo que ocurriera, el presente sigue abrazando esa fórmula, eso es incuestionable. Y ya puestos, pasando de un género a otro, ¿qué opina Brenda del RPG actual si lo comparamos con el que ella conoció en aquellos primeros pasos profesionales íntimamente ligados al rol?
RPG games have grown so much, just so much. I don't know that I have a singular opinion on them. You could sit down and jump into an MMO like World of Warcraft and never need to play another game. You could play something like Breath of the Wild, like John is mentioning, which is a beautiful experience, incredibly. I feel for every other game that came out the year that game was released, because it just, what a masterwork. And, that's what Nintendo has the ability to do. But there's the state of RPGs right now. Like, we used to think if you had to have an RPG, it was Dungeons and Dragons, get your party together, get one character together, go off into the dungeon, go out into the world, battle monsters, get swords. And role-playing games have found their way after watching all the great houses of RPG collapse, like Wizardry and Might and Magic and The Bard's Tale and Ultima, these massive series, watching them sort of fall, seeing new beautiful series rise that were more simple, like Diablo, right? And now RPGs have actually found their way into shooters, if we think of something like Borderlands. And there's been an amazing, and I know I'm not just sticking to computers, but there's been an amazing resurgence in Dungeons and Dragons. We were talking about the Satanic Panic earlier, and I remember when I was growing up, the fact that I like Dungeons and Dragons and Black Sabbath was literally a tremendous concern to some friends' parents. And I hid that a lot. But now, now with the Stranger Things coming out, it's really cool to like D&D. Like I would have, if I had been a kid now as opposed to back in the 80s, I would have been super cool. Instead, back in the 80s, I was super hardcore nerd class. So I don't know, it's everything about RPGs. Everything about RPGs has changed. They are ubiquitous. They are no longer evil. The practicing of magic is not, actually, as much as I want to say it, the practice of magic in games does not promote or does not mean you're going to get letters. Sometimes John still gets letters that have nothing to do with magic, usually has to do with demons and other things, but everything has changed.
Y también sobre el presente y sobre algunos temas peliagudos que fueron noticia en fechas recientes, quisimos hablar con John y Brenda para conocer la opinión de dos personalidades que han vivido de primera mano la evolución del medio desde sus comienzos. Por un lado, la adquisición de estudios por parte de las grandes marcas de hardware, con lo que eso supone de cara a posibles exclusividades, pero también la inyección económica de dichos gigantes. ¿Es en última instancia algo bueno para el usuario? ¿O pueden tener estos movimientos alguna consecuencia negativa para el sector?
Well, this is something that's happened forever. It hasn't stopped, And even if you look at Activision Blizzard, it used to be Activision over here, Blizzard over here. Blizzard had acquired companies to make Blizzard. Blizzard North was Condor Entertainment. That was a separate company. Like all companies do this. They buy another company, they get a little bit bigger, they merge with other companies, they get bought by a bigger company. I mean, this is nonstop, and this has been going on forever. It's not going to stop. That's the way business works. Consolidation, and then people leave, they split off, like Bungie being part of the company and then like leaving, and this is something that just normally happens. The games themselves are made by dev teams that have nothing to do with that business stuff. But this is stuff, there may be something that comes down from the top, like, okay, well, Microsoft now owns this. They don't want these games to be on Sony's hardware now or Nintendo's hardware. That's the high-level decision, but it's not changing the way that those games are made. It's not changing like what the sequel will be like. It would have been like that no matter how many platforms it was going to be on, right? So it's good in the fact that if somebody is buying a company, they're interested in it and they want the thing that company has, which means they're going to make it happen. Like the fact that id was purchased by Bethesda was great. That means that there will be new Dooms and Quakes and Wolfensteins, right? If that didn't happen, who knows what would have gone on with the IPs, right? So, and the fact that Microsoft then bought ZeniMax is great as well. That just means that it now has a home that Bethesda was a really great home for Doom for a long time, for id Software, and Bethesda being with Microsoft is even better. It's like now has a partner that actually has been in the game industry for decades and has been the driver of the entire industry since the 70s. I mean, can't find a bigger, better partner than that, really. So.
Y que eso sea así, garantiza el futuro del sector a través de sus títulos. Hay de fondo en sus palabras un mensaje que va más allá de la ya manida batalla de sistemas y exclusivos, y que apunta a disfrutar de los juegos sin reparar en qué plataforma corren, a centrarnos en lo mucho y bueno que tenemos disponible y en no entrar en debates sobre qué hardware es mejor.
If you look at the last previous generation of hardware, the PS3 and the Xbox One had the same hardware. They just had different UI, like they were using the same hardware. And now it's different, right? The hardware is different, but they're still very good consoles. They really vary in just the UI, the sensibility of the UI, the design. But games, some people might be purists for certain platforms, but I think the majority of people just want to play cool games, and whatever it's on, they're going to get it. Like if there's a game I got to play, Breath of the Wild, I'm going to get a Switch because I want to play that game. It's not because, I hate Nintendo. I'll never play the best game in the world on a Nintendo. Like, no one's.
And just to be clear, John does not hate Nintendo. Just to be clear.
No, Nintendo's amazing.
Far from it.
I love Nintendo.
Menos mal, qué susto. Pero sí, tiene razón. A veces nos perdemos en absurdas batallas defendiendo marcas, olvidando que tenemos suerte de vivir tiempos en los que hay tantos juegos, más allá del sistema en el que corren, con los que disfrutar. Eso, y el legado de lo que nuestros protagonistas de hoy dieron a la industria, es más que suficiente para que no nos distraigamos en debates estériles. Que sus reflexiones y palabras en este Memory Card Profiles nos hagan entender que este medio sigue vivo y que su presente es tan rico como lo fue su pasado. Uno al que John y Brenda Romero se entregaron durante años, forjándose un nombre en un sector ávido de mentes brillantes y de talento, y que hoy hemos recorrido de su mano para recordar algunos de los momentos que vivieron en primera persona, y para conocerles un poco más de cerca. Estaréis conmigo en que lo que nos han contado no podría ser más interesante. John, Brenda, muchísimas gracias por vuestro tiempo y por seguir poniendo en valor un sector que tiene en grandes como vosotros un activo inestimable.
Hemos visto muchas cosas que tienen que ver más allá de ese Doom y de ese Wizardry con el que ellos se hicieron en su día conocidos y que en el fondo no dejan de ser dos iconos y dos puntos de inflexión en la industria, con cuestiones que en el fondo están siempre presentes de una manera u otra, que quisimos con ellos abordar y para las que nos han dado un punto de vista yo creo que muy interesante. Como digo, siempre es una ilusión que tengamos pues protagonistas como ellos y sobre todo que estéis pendientes vosotros de lo que tenemos que decir en Profiles y en Memory Card cada 15 días, en general viajando al pasado con MeriStation y contando un montón de cosas que hay todavía por contar del mundillo este que disfrutamos tanto. Chicos, nos vamos, que está lloviendo y el sitio es maravilloso, pero ya la cosa nos invita a alejarnos. Un saludo, chao.